Good morning, guys. I think this is our first verbal lesson since spring break is ended. So hopefully everybody's doing pretty well. We've been looking at measurements now of human development for a little while, measurements of HDI, and even getting a look at which countries are more developed than others, just kind of via the actual statistical data that we have. Like for example, the way that HDI is calculated by the United Nations. But the reality is that a country's overall development can oftentimes mask inequalities in the status of men and women. Sadly, long-standing cultural and legal obstacles can oftentimes limit, for example, women's participation in development and access to benefits. Realistically speaking, if you're talking about how we can measure this, because we can, first of all, let's go ahead and say it. There are no countries in the world where women are going to be treated equal to men. That country just doesn't exist. And at best, women have achieved near equality with men in some countries. But in other countries, the level of gender development lags way behind. Now, it really wasn't until the 1990s that the UN started deciding to kind of tackle this situation. It was in the year 1995 that the city of Beijing and China hosted the United Nations Development Programs, the UNDP, their fourth conference on women. This conference basically continued the UN's mission to remove obstacles to women's active participation in all areas of public and private life by providing them with an equal role in economic, in social, and cultural, and in political decision making. And there were several different concerns that were brought up at this conference. Whether it be economic or social or cultural or political concerns. But ultimately, what this conference called for was increasing data available on women. And so, in order to measure the extent of a country's gender inequality, the United Nations decided to develop something called the GII, the Gender Inequality Index. And so what the Gender Inequality Index basically does is it combines a measurement of empowerment, labor, and reproductive health for women. And so when you combine those, just like we do with HDI, right? We take several different concepts and we combine it into a single number. When you combine measurement of empowerment, labor, and reproductive health, you get a GII score. The higher the GII, the greater the inequality between men and women. So it works a lot like HDI. A score of a 0 would mean men and women are completely equal in a society. And of course, that society doesn't exist. And a score of a 1.0 would mean that women fare as poorly as possible in all measures. And that country also doesn't exist. So everything is kind of in the middle here, right? The closer that you are to 0, the better the better the gender equality. The closer you are to the number 1, the kind of poorer the gender equality. There are actually, in fact, 10 countries in Europe with GIIs less than 0.1, which is pretty interesting. The United States' current GII score is a 0.189, so on the lower end, but not in the lowest. So GII is measured through looking at empowerment, labor, and reproductive health. So how does that work? How do you measure empowerment? Well, in the case of GII, empowerment refers to the ability of women to achieve improvements in their own status, to basically achieve economic and political power. So therefore, there are two measurements here that are used. The first measurement is the percentage of women or the percentage of seats held by women in a national legislature. So in that case, in the case of the U.S., or the national legislature here would be the Congress, right? The House of Representatives and the Senate. Well, the highest percentage, and this kind of is surprising to some, but it works. I'm looking for a chart here that I may or may not find, so please bear with me in the madness here. Well, I thought I had a map going along with this, but I don't actually know if I do. So if that's the case, hang on one second. I'm going to go ahead and just go back to this. The highest percentage of women that hold legislative seats is actually in Africa, interestingly enough. Sometimes close to half the seats in some African countries are held by women in national legislatures. Rwanda is over half. Europe, about 1/4 in most European countries, about 1/4 of those legislative seats are held by women. In the United States, the number is currently 23.7%. There's 26 women in the U.S. Senate. There are 101 women out of 435 in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so that it means 23.7%. Your lowest percentage of women holding seats in the national legislature would be in the Middle East, if we're talking about regionally. And then the second statistic that is looked at, and this is a very interesting one, because, well, it's interesting for a number of reasons. So the first way that we measure empowerment is the percentage of seats held by women in the national legislature. The second way that we measure empowerment is the percentage of women who have completed some high school. So we're not even talking about like women that hold high school diplomas. We're just talking about women that have completed some high school. So this is actually kind of a low bar when you really think about it. But even at that low bar, worldwide, only 54% of women have completed some high school, only 54%. And believe it or not, the number is actually not a lot better for men. Only 64% of men have completed some high school. So there's some definite economic issues that goes along with that. But that's where we're at. 54% of women globally have completed some high school. Now in North America, girls are actually more likely than boys to complete high school. Which is interesting. And boys are actually just slightly ahead in Europe. In developing countries, though, boys are much more likely than girls to become high school graduates. Basically, for every 10 boys who graduate in a developed country, 8 girls graduate. But in like the developing world, like in South Asia, for every 10 boys that graduate, only 5 girls graduate. But in this case, we're just talking about women that have completed some high school, percentage of. That goes into this measurement. No, so what does that have to do with empowerment, right? Well, the more educated a woman is, the more likely that she's going to be able to be empowered in the workplace, right? In some sort of like managerial role, for example. So this is a statistic that we look at very seriously. Of course, there's a completely separate stat that we look at to measure women in the labor force. It's known as the female labor force participation rate, which is basically the percentage of women holding full-time jobs outside of the home. Basically, for every 100 men in the labor force, there are about 75 women in the labor force in developed countries, and about 65 women for every 100 men in the labor force in developing countries. And we're talking about, once again, holding a full-time job outside the home. Again, actually in Africa, the ratio is actually the world's highest, at about 77 women for every 100 men, right? Of course, you see that Africa lags behind, though, in the Gender Inequality Index overall on the map that you're looking at on your screen. And one of the reasons why is that the percentage of women who have completed some high school is pretty low, but also pretty low are the measurements of reproductive health. poor reproductive health is a major contributor to gender inequality around the world. And there's actually two indicators that we look at here, two measurements that we look at overall. One is called the maternity mortality ratio. And so what the maternity mortality ratio is it's the number of women who die giving births per 100,000 births. Number of women who die giving births per 100,000 births. In developed countries, it's about 16. About 16 women will die giving birth out of 100,000. So it's a pretty low rate. But in the developing world, wow, much, much higher. 171 women will die giving birth per 100,000 currently. And as far as adolescent fertility rate is concerned, this is the fifth and final measure that we look at to measure gender empowerment. This is also one that measures reproductive health, the adolescent fertility rate. So this is basically the number of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19. Okay? The number of births per 100,000 women that are aged 15 to 19. Basically a rate of teenage pregnancy overall, or rate of teenage moms, I should say, overall. In the developed world, that's about 19. About 19 women ages 15 to 19 will have a baby out of 1,000 women of that age. In the developing world, that number is actually 53. Yeah, so quite a bit higher, 53 births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19. Okay. Europe's the lowest in the world as far as region is concerned. And trying to read my handwriting here, Europe's number is 10. In Africa, it's about 110 right now. So you see that gap there, right? Much higher number of teenage moms, right? Which overall is going to lead to a lower score when it comes to gender inequality. So that's how it's measured. What does it look like? Well, let's take a look. So if you take a look at the chart here, you will see what we're talking about, the evidence that we're talking about. These are the most recent stats I have were from 2017. Norway's got the very highest. Well, hold on a second. No, excuse me. This is a little bit of a confusing chart actually because it's ranked by HDI. So Norway's at the very top there. And Norway's actually got a very high gender inequality rank as well. But the highest GII in the world is actually Switzerland at a 0.039, as you can see there, and I'm kind of circling that here. Number 2, Denmark. It looks like there's a tie for 3 between the Netherlands and Sweden. And then Norway rounding out the top 5 there. So anyhow, you get an idea of what that looks like rankings-wise. The United States is currently ranked 41 in the world with the GII score here. On the lower end of things, notice that some countries will not report GII statistics fully, so therefore we don't get a ranking on them. But some of your lower ranked countries, again, tend to be where you see lower HDI as a whole in sub-Saharan Africa. All right, so that's how we measure GII. Tomorrow we'll take a look at some more issues to round out the week, looking at just kind of women in development in general and the way it works. And so we will see you for that tomorrow. Have a good day.